Hi, and welcome to the Jewish Policy Center webinar series. I am Shoshana Bryan, Senior Director of the Jewish Policy Center and your host. So we're 3 months in, and slowly but surely, or not slowly, but certainly surely, the conversation over the Hamas massacres and Israel's war of self-defense has morphed into a conversation about the day after. The U.S. is leading the charge, however, on a failed principle. I'm not even going to get into Secretary of State Antony Blinken's conversations with Turkey and Qatar, both of whom openly have supported Hamas. I'm not going to talk about his meeting with PA dictator and Hamas terrorist paymaster Mahmud Abbas. Oh, I will say, however, did you see the picture where Abbas and Blinken are sitting together, and Abbas did not put the customary American flag behind the American Secretary of State, and said Secretary of State chose to sit in front of a blank wall while Abbas sat in front of what he calls the flag of Palestine. But I'm not going to discuss that. I'm also not going to discuss Mr. Blinken's adamant belief in the two-state solution, which has bitten the dust. The failed principle we're going to talk about today is the underlying assumption made by those people, Americans and others, who have plans for a peaceful future in the region. Every one of those plans, every one of those proposals relies on the idea that Israel's enemies can be, as they say, demilitarized. That A, you can get a hostile party to agree to give up its weapons, and B, when that party agrees, it will live by its commitments. Call me a skeptic. And I think you can call our guest today, David Weinberg, a skeptic as well. David's going to talk about what he calls the myth of demilitarization. Before we get to David, I'm going to do the short form of our JPC commercial. Then I'm going to leave the rest to him. The Jewish Policy Center is a 501c3 organization founded in 1985 to provide perspectives and analysis of foreign and domestic policies. I know we haven't done very many domestic policies lately. We're a little swamped. To bring you those things addressed by leading scholars, academics, and commentators. You can find all of our work on our website at jewishpolicycenter.org. That's jewishpolicycenter.org. We support a strong American defense capability, U.S.-Israel security cooperation, and missile defense. We support the legitimacy and security of the State of Israel against anyone who would deny them, including the International Criminal Court. And we absolutely support the right and authority of the democratically elected government of Israel to determine the strategy and tactics of the IDF in its current war. Our guest today is David Weinberg, a government relations and foreign policy specialist based in Israel. He made Aliyah in 1990 from Canada and also has lived in the United States. David is a senior fellow at Misgav, the Institute for National Security and Zionist Strategy, and also senior fellow at Habithonistim, Israel's Defense and Policy Forum. He's a columnist for the Jerusalem Post and Israel Hayom, and you've seen several of his articles on the JPC website, which I expect is why a lot of you were here. We have a great audience today. A prominent lecturer on public affairs, David has spoken in Israel, in Canada, in the US, and Europe, at shuls, federations, advocacy forums, and universities. He has been in the media everywhere you think he should be, and he has been quoted by a great many international publications. And David knows a lot about a lot of things. You're going to hear that today. I will say the one that surprised me most when we first met is that he is also an accredited expert on Israeli and kosher wine, having studied enology at the London-based Wine and Spirit Education Trust, the world's leading institute for qualifying sommeliers. And you have to learn to say that right. I had to look it up. In his spare time, he conducts food and wine tours in Israel and writes about kosher wine from around the world. And David, if somebody doesn't ask you about wine and tours and Israel, I'm going to do it. But in the meantime, David Weinberg, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Shoshana, and hello to all listeners on this program. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the issues of the day with you. And let's start, as you suggested, Shoshana, with the myth of demilitarization. to put a summary sentence right up at the top, it's clear to me that only full Israeli military control of the territories adjacent to Israel has any chance of preventing enemy military buildup, and even then it will remain a difficult and ongoing challenge. Now, we need to step back, as you suggested, and remind ourselves that in every Israeli-Palestinian deal concluded ever since the dawn of the Oslo process in 1993, it's been clear, it's been explicit, that the Israeli public would not countenance living alongside any Palestinian entity that houses a terrorist infrastructure or active hostile military forces. The definite Israeli assumption was that the defense forces, the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF, could deny or block massive military armament of a Palestinian government. And the unequivocal Israeli expectation was that massive military armament would not be sought by a peaceful Palestinian partner. Unfortunately, 3 decades of Palestinian terror and missile attacks from Judea and Samaria and Gaza, and of course the Hamas attack on southern Israel of 3 months ago, with the gargantuan amounts of weaponry that have been discovered since in Gaza, all this has blown out of the water all assumptions and expectations regarding the possibility to truly demilitarize a Palestinian-held area without the Israeli forces doing it. And therefore, the attendant conclusion is clear as well. Only full Israeli military control of the territory adjacent to Israel has any chance of preventing enemy military buildup. Just to give you some numbers. In these last months of fighting in Gaza, Israel has destroyed well over 300,000 rockets, drones, mines, rocket-propelled grenades, missiles, hundreds of thousands of rounds of ammunition. It's also captured millions of shekels worth of cash, meant for, as well as documents that expose how the tens of millions and more were expended on weapons purposes and terror tunnels. The terror attack tunnel network in Gaza that has been discovered thus far is 500 times greater than what the Israeli military had assessed before this campaign began. The scope of the captured munitions is unprecedented, especially anti-tank missiles, is on a scale reminiscent of and even beyond anything that American forces found in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan in the wars of the past 2 decades. And a lot of this weaponry was clearly smuggled in from Egypt into Gaza through the Rafah quadrant, what's known as the Philadelphia corridor. And additional weaponry was manufactured inside Gaza using dual-use goods that unfortunately were imported into Gaza with Israeli approval and even support. Things like fiberglass, metals, ball bearings, and of course, cement. There's millions and millions of tons of cement that Israel allowed into Gaza for rehabilitation and construction, much of which was poured into the terror attack tunnels. And then you have to remember, 3D laser printers can, which you can hide in almost any basement, can produce weaponry as well. No large and identifiable manufacturing facilities are truly necessary. And again, all this means that the demilitarization of zones where Palestinians assume governments over themselves is a myth. It's neither possible to enforce from afar, nor reasonable to expect in any territory evacuated by Israel. Only the Israeli military can and will enforce or permanently demilitarize Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. look at an area, not in Gaza, but in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria, like Jenin in northern Samaria, which is under full civilian and security control of the Palestinian Authority. It's what's known as Area A from the Oslo era. Jenin has become Gaza. We have there the beginnings of Gaza scale manufacturing capability. Hundreds of professional grade weapons, not just homemade ragtag weaponry, have been discovered and confiscated over the past month in Jenin. The IDF has to go into Jenin like it's going into Gaza in full scale battle complement with D9 bulldozers, tanks, the most sophisticated armored personnel carriers, and troops in full battle gear. But the only reason that Katyusha rockets and missiles are not raining down every day from Kalkilia or Jenin into Gush Dan, into Greater Tel Aviv, is the fact that the IDF maintains overall military control, overall security control over the West Bank envelope, and direct control over areas B and C, which is about 70–80% of the West Bank. Only that keeps the terrorists off base. And that's the only reason why places like Jenin have not yet become Hamas bastions as Gaza. This has a long pedigree. Yasser Arafat started on day one. When he came to Jericho, remember Gaza and Jericho first? That was the first stage of the Oslo Accords. From day one, he financed, directed, and equipped 16 different competing Palestinian militias, giving over 60,000 so-called security personnel weapons through local manufacturing and smuggling and Israeli shipments of weapons to the Palestinian Authority, which was going to be under American security guidance. In short, it didn't take long until they turned their guns against IDF troops and Israeli civilians. And there are reports that there are Palestinian Authority forces today massing for Hamas-style raids into Israeli towns too, both settlements within Judea and Samaria and Israeli cities and towns like Kfar Saba or the Emek Hefer area along the Green Line, along the Seam Line in north of Tel Aviv. And since none of Arafat's successors have ripened into real partners for peace, Mahmud Abbas has not offered one, what should I say, not even one dash of distaste, never mind a clear condemnation of the attacks of October 7th. And of course, he continues to pay for slay. As you mentioned earlier, Shoshana, he pays people for terrorism against Israel. So the bottom line is that the suggestion that Israel give the Palestinian Authority more authority or expanded territory in the West Bank to bring it back as the ruler of Gaza in a post-Hamas Gaza, these suggestions are both outrageous and dangerous. And we've heard them from many international actors, including the Biden administration. Unfortunately, Abbas and his Fatah party never have been and never will ensure demilitarization of the territories. And I'm not sure they're capable of ever bringing real peace with Israel either. All the other suggestions about posing a broader pan-Arab security force in Gaza to ensure the demilitarization of Gaza going forward, they're also similarly unrealistic. There is no Emirati, Saudi, Egyptian, Turkish, Jordanian, or what have not, security force that's going to come in, fight the bad guys in Gaza and demilitarize the area instead of Israel. And so then you might ask me, so what is this scenario for the day after? for Gaza going forward? And I'll answer that I don't know, and you shouldn't be asking me because I'm Israeli and it's not my problem. My problem as an Israeli is to ensure that there is no fighting force in Gaza going forward that can once again threaten Israeli civilians. And to that extent, the Israeli military is going to do what it can now to rout out Hamas and to continue to operate in pinpoint fashion in Gaza far, far into the future. Who's going to administer Gaza? Not my problem. Maybe there'll be chaos in Gaza for 50 years going forward. That's the Arab world's problem. That's maybe the international community's problem. It's no longer going to be Israel's problem. It's important to remember that the average age in Gaza is 18 years old, which means that at least 50% of the residents of Gaza have been educated over the last 20 years by Hamas, in Hamas schools with the murderous jihadist views and worldview that they believe in. So it's not like there's an alternative moderate leadership in Gaza that some in the international community are conjuring up in their crystal balls. That's likely to come forward and take the reins from Hamas. There will likely be much chaos in Gaza going forward. What Israel needs to do is ensure the continuous demilitarization of Gaza and Judea and Samaria, because no one else will seriously do so. To believe otherwise is mythology, and dangerous mythology at that.
Okay, so we have questions for you. You mentioned that there are people who have a kind of conception that an international Arab force, perhaps Gulf Arabs, perhaps Jordanians or whatever, might work on the security issues in Gaza. Doesn't it seem more likely that you would get international Arab support for the reconstruction of Gaza if Israel was in charge of security, rather than asking them to kill Arabs should that become necessary? Doesn't it seem more realistic that Israel creates the security perimeter and then the other Arab countries could participate in reconstruction?
Perhaps, and it is certainly true that Israel is going to take charge of a broad and thick security perimeter. As we speak, the Israeli military is clearing a strip of about 1 kilometer deep on the Gazan side of what had been the border fence until Hamas demolished it in 39 places on October 7th in order to invade Israel. And that will run from the northern end of the Gaza Strip all the way to the southern end. What happens on the Philadelphia corridor, which is the border between Gaza and Egypt, is a really big and critical question. I know that it's being discussed and negotiated at the highest and most secret levels of Israeli and Egyptian contacts, obviously involving the administration from Washington as well. I don't know what's going to be there, but Israel is going to maintain a broad and deep security perimeter around Gaza so that the type of raids we saw on October 7th can never happen again. And Israeli forces, I believe, will be operating deep inside Gaza in pinpoint and targeted fashion for many years to come. It will take at least a year or two, according to most estimates, to ferret out and destroy all the underground, never mind the above ground, but all the underground Hamas military facilities. You know, this is not one of our key topics right now, but I have to mention it.
Right.
Every school, every kindergarten, every municipal building, every gym, every community center, every UNRWA facility, every single one has proven to have been booby-trapped by Hamas, used as a weapons storehouse by Hamas, used as cover for shafts that go down deep into the ground, into Hamas's underground bunkers and terror attack tunnels. Every single one. You know, we've talked for many years about how terrible UNRWA is as an ideological institution, an institution that perpetuates Palestinian refugeehood forever, as an educational institution, because they run most of the schools in Gaza, that teaches the most horrible genocidal propaganda against Israel. That's almost besides the point at this point. We now have concrete evidence of how every single UNRWA facility has been a military base of operations for Hamas, completely penetrated, completely assimilated into Hamas's long-term military planning against Israel. So there's a long way to go. This is going to be a long and difficult cleanup. We already see the toll that it's taking on the young men of Israel. There's nobody in this country unaffected. Everyone knows someone injured or killed in the campaign against Hamas thus far. In my own neighborhood, there are a dozen families with young men, injured soldiers, or brother-in-laws, or cousins, or colleagues who've lost eyes, who've lost legs, who've lost limbs, who will be in rehabilitation for months, if not years. Never mind those killed. I just came back several minutes ago from a shiva in Ra'anana of one of the soldiers killed this weekend, prominent Canadian expatriate family. It's all around us, and the long-term effort to completely rout out Hamas's military bases in Gaza, as we just discussed, will inevitably claim more casualties going forward. It's amazing that Israelis are up for the task. There is no demand in this country for Israel to scale down the operation, just the opposite. The government were to pull back now, or bend to the will of the international community, South Africa, for example, to stop the military campaign, then this country would explode in anger. There'd be 2 million Israelis out in the street demanding the resignation of the government, not because of October 7th, but because it failed to carry through with the campaign to crush Hamas after October 7th. So this country is determined to pursue this to the nth degree necessary.
So let's push this forward a little bit on the assumption that the Israeli government is going to continue to pursue the path it has been pursuing. There are two other fronts, immediate fronts in the war. There is Lebanon with Hezbollah, and there is the West Bank, which isn't the same kind of active front at the moment, but certainly could be. So let's push the question. It seems that if you look at historical evidence, when Israel leaves space, essentially leaves a vacuum behind, the bad guys fill the vacuum. So you had Israeli withdrawal from southern Lebanon, you ended up with Hezbollah, despite the fact that the UN, of course, has Resolution 1701, and they claim and they promise and they tell you, okay, you have Israel withdrawing from Gaza in 2005, you have Hamas, you have Israel making various arrangements with Abbas and the Palestinian Authority, and where Israel isn't, the bad guys are. Does this lead you to believe that Israel will not be withdrawing from territory and not permitting other people to be responsible for territory on the other fronts? Does this bode ill for Anthony Blinken and President Biden's two-state solution? Are we seeing the end of Oslo?
No one here in Israel is talking about a two-state solution these days. And
No, you're not, but we are very loud.
And any Israeli politician that would plaster that on his campaign posters would be resoundingly defeated at this point. In your iteration of fronts, you left out one immediate front, which of course is the Red Sea, where the Houthi rebels of Yemen are attacking and harassing international shipping. Washington has said that it's putting together, quote unquote, an international coalition to take on the Houthis. Here in Israel, people guffawed about that. If you're going to take on the Houthis, just do it. Washington has the firepower, the overwhelming firepower to crush the Houthis. And if you really understand the threat they pose to international shipping, then deal with it. You don't need the French, the Canadians, or the British in an international coalition in order to handle the Houthis. So the very notion that Washington is now setting up an international coalition is somewhat ridiculous. It's a sign that the administration does not want to fight, even when it's facing a concrete challenge that really has nothing to do with Israel. But to directly answer your question, no, Israel's not withdrawing from additional territories in Judea and Samaria anytime in the medium to even distant future. How and when Israel is going to challenge Hezbollah in a direct military confrontation beyond the military confrontation that is currently underway, I don't know. I suspect that's a conflict that's still quite a ways off in the future. It's not a good thing for Israel to have to fight a two-front war. Hezbollah is a military challenge of an order that's many times the challenge of Hamas, dug deep into the mountains and the valleys of Lebanon in a territory that's, I don't know, 10 times, maybe 25 times, maybe 50 times the size of Gaza, with a large civilian population. And of course, like Hamas, Hezbollah has dug its weapons depot and firing positions deep under the villages of southern Lebanon, making it very difficult for Israel to destroy them from the air. It's not a conflict that Israel wants to get into just now, and I'm not sure Iran wants Hezbollah to blow its gunpowder at this time against Israel. But yes, there is a grim period of struggle ahead for Israel. I say over the next decade. It requires a resilience and a recalibration of Israeli national identity to a certain extent. But that's a whole new topic.
So I would just point out to you that Italy, Spain, and France have announced they will not be joining the U.S. coalition in the Red Sea. They will have their own ships there. They will take care of their own shipping, but they've announced that they're not joining the coalition. And I think that goes to your point that there are people who are concerned about the U.S. position and the U.S. ability to follow through and take care of things. Those are three big allies. Turning away from that, clearly it has taken years for Hamas to get where it is, for Hezbollah to get where it is, the Palestinian Authority being somewhat different. But nevertheless, it's where it is. And that means that for a very long time, money and all of these other things have been coming into those organizations on the ground, facilitated in the case of Gaza by the United States, by Qatar, and by the Israeli government. What do people say about that? I mean, was Israel protesting all the time it was letting that stuff in? And I'm not just picking on the current government. Previous governments did it as well. Different governments did it as well. Nobody stopped the flood. Nobody stopped the cement. Nobody stopped the money. One could have said then that Israel is complicit in this. Where do you go with that thought?
Yeah, many self-conceptions as well as myths have been shattered by the October 7th Hamas invasion and what we've discovered in Gaza ever since. Many mistakes have been made. We have a political elite that for many years bought into the notion that Palestinians and other Arabs in the region only sought peace and prosperity, like Israelis. That improvement in the quality of life for Gazans, allowing Gazans to work in Israel and allowing every international aid agency to ship material into Gaza and allowing Israeli businessmen to trade with Gaza, that economic development and prosperity for Palestinians were the key to stability and peace. And it's a rude awakening, really for everyone, although some knew this beforehand, that Hamas conduct is not a function of, is not guided by Palestinian economic well-being, but rather by cosmic, ideological, annihilationist rationale. Its resistance, as they call it, against Israel is a function of a religious national struggle with enduring motivational roots. It's not economic hardship, poverty, and despair that generates Arab terrorism, but hope. The hope, the faith, the belief, the aspiration to destroy Israel and Zionism. And therefore, Israel has to prove that their time has not come, that the gates of jihadist heaven have not yet opened for them. And it's a rude awakening. Israel indeed made many mistakes. I would argue beginning with the Oslo Accords themselves, in assuming that the Palestinians were ready for a grand reconciliation with Israel, ideological reconciliation with Israel, as long as they had land, territory, prosperity, economic development, and so on. I mean, just think back to the promises of billions of aid from everyone in the world, including from Arab countries in the Trump peace plan. Promised the Palestinians if only they would settle their grievances with Israel, and they threw it out the door. They chucked it out the door and said, no, thank you. And this takes me back to what I briefly mentioned earlier. It's somewhat of a stark and dark self-conception for Israelis to realize, perhaps for the first time in 30, 40 years, that we are a nation in endless struggle against Arab Islamic jihadists. It's kind of hard to stomach. It's sobering. But reorienting Israeli society in a way, really harking back to Zev Jabotinsky's Iron Wall concept, a concept that was adopted by David Ben-Gurion, that we need to be strong defensively and strong offensively, offensively meaning in terms of military, in terms of settlement, in terms of pioneering, and that over time will create the iron wall that will bring the Arab and Islamic world to a realization that Israel cannot be defeated. In many ways, we've gone soft. There was a speech given by an Israeli prime minister just a couple years ago at the UN. It wasn't Netanyahu, so go figure who it was, in which he talked about how all Israelis want is to live in peace and prosperity with their neighbors, which is nice language, but perhaps was the wrong message, because that doesn't resonate, unfortunately, on the other side. And if you ask me about regional peace, Abraham Accord type peace treaties that we were all so caught up in just a year or two ago, with the hopes for an expansion of the Abrahamic Accords regional peace process to Saudi Arabia and other countries. I'll say to you that it's still possible, but it's dependent on Israeli steadfastness. It's Israel's steadfast struggle, its willingness to combat radical Islam, its necessary and probable military victories, the sacrifices of its brave young men and Israeli families, the stamina of its civilians. This is what might bring regional peace that will draw the Saudis and other Arab states into more open partnership with Israel and eventually squash or sideline the regional jihadists. But it requires a very renewed, tough national security doctrine, and even a renewed Israeli national identity.
Which one would hope will emerge. But you went back to what I consider the origin of the problem here. And it's not Jabotinsky's thinking or anyone's thinking way back then, but the Oslo Accords, in which the Oslo Accords called for a police force of some, I don't know, a couple of thousands of police officers under the watchful eye of an American general, a man that I knew. It very quickly became something else. I remember being there and meeting those guys with groups of American military officers, one of whom discreetly declined to shake hands with the Palestinians because he said they weren't police, they were military officers masquerading as police. And he turned out to be correct. So there was an evolution of the Palestinian Authority police from what they agreed to do and what Israel agreed to do in the Oslo Accords to a kind of functional army. And you talked about these other militias and competing groups. At what point was Israel complaining? At what point was the general complaining? I know there were generals who weren't happy about this, American generals, but it kept going. And it seems to me that at some point Israel decided it was better to let it evolve as it was evolving than try to take it on. A, is that a correct assessment? And B, when did that kind of happen?
Indeed, the strong police force, that's the exact quote. The strong police force envisioned in the Oslo Accords has mushroomed into really a monster of anywhere between 45 to 60,000 armed military men in Judea and Samaria today, divided into a dozen different and competing security forces. Not at all clear that they're under one clear command, and many of whom have been trained by, as you say, by the American Dayton forces, named after General Dayton, and others who've gone to Jordan and even to really bad countries in the region for training. When did the strong police force of Oslo become a threatening, almost out of control military force? I guess it happened pretty quickly because, as I said, Arafat set up 16 competing security forces, but it took a long time till Israel was prepared to recognize that. It wasn't in Israel's political interest in the time. The Israeli governments that spawned and backed the Oslo process did not want to admit. I guess it was the so-called Second Intifada, which then had to be crushed, which Prime Minister Sharon then crushed in the year 2000. That's when Israel was forced to recognize that it had a significant problem on its hands. Why doesn't Israel collapse the Palestinian Authority today or act to crush the Palestinian military forces? And the answer is because we still have some residual hope that a full-scale reoccupation of all Judea and Samaria can be avoided, that explosion leading to full-scale warfare can be avoided. The Palestinian Authority security forces do cooperate with Israel to a degree in order to crush surgent Hamas and Islamic Jihad cells in Judea and Samaria. So the Israeli military feels there is some residual value in working with the Palestinian Authority security forces, while knowing that it can't really rely on them at the same time. And in a post-Abbas area, all hell could break loose.
So you mentioned something that I think a lot of people are not aware of, and that is that the Palestinian Authority is being attacked in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria, by Hamas forces. I think pretty much we know about the 2007 Palestinian Civil War, but I don't think people realize that Hamas is embedding itself in Judea and Samaria. Now, the question there is, who supports them? How much of this is an Iranian function attempting to create, first of all, just more space for its friend Hamas, but also to surround Israel on all sides by Iranian-supported armies, militias, friends, terrorists, whatever. Talk about Iran.
So the short answer to your question, Shoshana, is yes, you're right, it is Iran. And Iranian leaders have made no secret of the fact that they seek to encircle Israel from all sides. They seek to undermine, destabilize the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan and turn Israel's longest border, the Israel-Egyptian border, Israel's eastern border, into a hot border. Much of the weaponry flowing into the West Bank is in fact smuggled in across the Jordan River from Syria into Jordan, or from Iraq into Jordan, and then from Jordan into the West Bank. And the Israeli military has not been particularly good, and the Jordanian army has not been particularly effective at interdicting those smuggling routes that have brought a lot of weaponry into the West Bank, particularly northern Samaria. Jenin, we talked about earlier. So yes, this is an Iranian plan. Iranian leaders have talked about this openly. They seek to make the Jordan Valley and then the highlands of Samaria and Judea into additional fronts. They clearly seek to undermine what's left of the Fatah-led Palestinian Authority. And if it wasn't for Israeli troops that operate nightly in Hebron and Jenin and elsewhere, the Palestinian Authority would fall almost immediately. It's Israeli bayonets that keep, believe it or not, Mahmud Abbas and his cronies in power as the least worse of the alternatives for the moment. I'm personally invested in this. I have a son who's been on reserve duty in the Jenin area ever since October 7th. I have a younger son who's been on reserve duty ever since October 9th in the southern Hebron Hills area. And they are both every night, either on laying in ambush or on penetrating raids into these dangerous Palestinian Authority controlled areas in order to crush the nascent cells of Hamas and Islamic Jihad and to keep the enemy at bay. It's actually somewhat of a miracle that over the last 3 months, since the war with Gaza started, the West Bank has not erupted into full-scale revolution or rebellion. And that's only because the Israeli military has been operating decisively in the West Bank every night. If you want, under the cover of the heavy fighting in Gaza, Israel is acting to do what it needs to do in Judea and Samaria in a way that it hasn't done for many decades.
Is Israel getting at least tacit support from Mahmoud Abbas for that? Clearly, we know what he says in public. We know what he does in public. But when the time comes for the Israelis to operate in Judea and Samaria, it serves his interest, doesn't it? Is he helpful? Is he harmful? Or does he keep his mouth shut?
Abbas never keeps his mouth shut, and he says all the most vile things about Israel and Israeli stormtroopers and Israeli troops. And his Ramallah-based Palestinian Authority has celebrated the October 7th Hamas massacres and continues to pay money to Palestinians to attack Israel. But the deal is that at nighttime, his policemen and soldiers disappear and allow Israeli troops to operate pretty much without interference. There was at least that. At least the armed Palestinians who are nominally loyal to the Palestinian Authority, in most cases, do not interfere with IDF operations. And the reason for that, as we just said, is because it serves Abbas's interests.
So what it sounds like, as we start to move toward the end of the program, it sounds as if Israel is going to be operating inside those territories, both Gaza and Judea and Samaria, and possibly Lebanon. I mean, but we'll kind of leave Lebanon to the side for the moment, for a very long time, to ensure that what happened in the past doesn't happen again in the future. That sounds like setting up for an Israeli-American clash of principles. The US seems to have a vision of where we're going and where Israel should be going because we said so. And Israel appears to have a slightly different vision of where it's going. How much stress do you think the relationship can take?
This goes back many years, and the Trump Middle East peace plan had it right. The Trump Middle East peace plan made it explicitly clear that whatever freedoms and prosperity Palestinians might have in their future can come about only in the context of an overall Israeli military security envelope. Whether it's border control, control of the strategic passes in the highlands of Judea or the mountains of Samaria, whether it's control over the electromagnetic wavelengths and the airspace of all the territories, whether it is essential Israeli control over the most critical infrastructures and resources, such as the mountain aquifers and the sources of water. It's only a overall Israeli security and administrative envelope that could possibly work. So yes, it's clear to Israelis that despite the runaway concepts of Palestinian statehood that have taken root in most Western capitals over the last 30 years, we're not going there. And whatever Palestinian entity or entities continue to sit alongside Israel, they ultimately will have to deal with an Israeli security envelope that is absolute and unquestioned.
Okay, so we had a question here because we're looking at various fronts, I suppose, and somebody asked us if there is an internal front and what has been the position of Israeli Arabs since October 7th. Is that a front? Is that a helpful group of people? Is that people you can turn to later for other things? Talk to us, if you would, about Israeli Arabs.
That's a really good question that requires a deep dive and a long answer. I'll try to give you a compact answer. I would say that over the last decade, maybe 2 decades, there have been 2 countervailing, very different trends underway in the Israeli Arab community. One, much discussed and written about in Israeli and Western media, is the positive trend towards greater integration of Israeli Arabs. in Israeli society, the advancement of women in the Israeli Arab community, going out, getting educated, going to work. Every Israeli here knows that every pharmacist in this country is an Israeli Arab. It's just the way it is. I challenge you to come to Israel, go to a pharmacy, and find a pharmacist who's not an Israeli Arab. Israeli Arabs at medical school, and a determined push, as I say, to advance women's rights in the Arab community and advance the status of Israeli Arabs. The Netanyahu governments have invested tens of billions of dollars in this. But on the other hand, there has been, in other parts of the Israeli Arab community, a trend towards real Islamic radicalization. And the Islamic movement in Israel, as well as bad actors from outside, have supported Islamic radicalization, as well as breakaway gangs of Arab mafia and Bedouin mafia who have taken over significant parts of the Galilee, as well as the Negev. And these difficult and dangerous forces have in fact rioted, and almost to the point of insurrection in recent years. In a recent campaign against, several years ago, against Hamas in Gaza, we had a near internal invasion on our hands, where in some Israeli Arab locations, there were pogroms against Israeli Jews. Major highways, traffic arteries were cut by marauding forces of Arabs who destroyed everything in sight. And yes, there was a real concern that now, during this operation against Gaza, Israeli Arabs could rise up in insurrectionist fashion and cause, internal problems. It hasn't happened. It hasn't happened. In fact, I would say most voices in the Israeli Arab community have condemned Hamas, and there have been the most heartwarming examples of Israeli Arab volunteerism and heroism, with both Bedouin Arabs fighting Hamas on the Gaza periphery and in the IDF, with Israeli Arab volunteers pitching in many ways in the national war effort. So there have been a lot of, as I said, heartwarming and encouraging signs, but it's a real issue. There's a battle underway within the Israeli Arab community for the heart and soul of that community, and it could yet go in completely divergent directions.
So we're coming to the end here, and you just preempted my positive question. People know that I like to ask a question at the end, the answer to which will be at least by and large positive. So I would say your Israeli Arab answer is at least by and large positive. On the other hand, my skepticism about demilitarization has only increased in the last hour. So people who are pushing demilitarization and we can trust them and you can be over here and they can be over there and it will work, I'm intensely more skeptical now. So I need one more positive question, or a question to which you will give me a positive answer. And I'm sure you will, because I'm going to ask you about what the best wines are right now for us to be buying, and how is the Israeli wine industry doing under wartime conditions?
Okay, thank you for that softball question. I'm always happy to talk about Israeli wines, but I do want to add a compliment or a positive remark that it is, of course, caveated. Israel has been surprised, positively surprised, by the degree of support that President Biden himself and the Biden administration has given Israel over the last 3 months. It's support that comes with great handcuffs, handcuffs that are getting tighter now. But Israel has received diplomatic support, concrete material support, weapons and ammunition from Washington. And I'm not sure there is another Democratic president in the next 50 years of America's diplomatic and political history that would give Israel such support. So, Israelis are very appreciative of the relationship with the Biden administration as it's played out over the last 3 months, while at the same time, as we've already discussed, feeling very hemmed in, constrained, and pressured in unhelpful ways by the administration's need to begin talking again now about a pie-in-the-sky two-state solution for the moment, to press Israel to scale down the scope of its campaign in Gaza. There's now American pressure to allow much more so-called humanitarian aid into Gaza, some of which fuels Hamas's war effort. There's now American pressure to push to allow for Israel to allow Palestinian residents who fled northern Gaza to return to their homes. That's a mistake for many reasons. There are some real gaps that are developing between Washington and Jerusalem today, which puts a damper on the good working relationship that did exist for the last couple of months. And I think it's important to recognize that as we dial down this conversation to a conclusion. The Israeli wine industry, in short, has been hard hit, as have many Israeli industries, both by the general downturn in the Israeli economy as a result of the war. People aren't going out. Places of entertainment are pretty much crushed. People aren't buying wine. And so many of the winemakers and their workers have been drafted over the last 3 months and are finding it difficult to complete their harvest and plan for the next season. So go out and buy Israeli wines. The industry needs the support. Having said that, they say that this past year's harvest was a good harvest. Most wineries had managed to pick their grapes and begin the winemaking processes in the wineries before October 7th. But so much is on hold. Construction is on hold. Development of new product lines are on hold. Sales are at a standstill. International sales are way down. Yes, it's like much of the Israeli economy. This is a difficult period, and that's a conversation in itself.
So as we leave, I'm going to say to our audience, do yourself a favor, as well as doing a good thing for the state of Israel, and go buy Israeli wine, but not only Israeli wine, buy Israeli products. It's a very helpful thing that we can do. People always ask me, what can we do to help Israel? There are tons of things. There are charities. There are lots of ways that you can give your money. But if you buy Israeli products, you will not only support the Israeli economy, but you will buy good stuff. And I can almost assure you that you will enjoy the wine. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And David Weinberg, thank you again for another great educational, occasionally uplifting, occasionally depressing, but very, very informative program. I think you've brought us to another way to look at the problem, and we need that. Thank you very much.
Long live Israel and the Jewish people. Thank you for your support in these difficult times, and good evening.